thrilled that you can join us today as we kick off our second annual Stand and Raise Parent Empowerment Speaker Series with different expert speakers featured each Tuesday throughout April. My name is Brittany Homer. I am the co-founder and executive director of Project Stand, mom of 4 kids, and your host for the next 4 weeks of this webinar series. Project Stand is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to prevent exploitation by empowering youth, parents, and school communities to stand and thrive by using technology in healthy ways. We invite you to follow us on Facebook and Instagram at projectstand.mediasafety, where you can stay updated on the latest resources that we have for parents and schools, including Stand Week, our student-led media safety program for middle schools. You can also go to our website, projectstand.org or mediasafety.org, and subscribe to receive a media safety tip of the week and other updates. This webinar series was created because we recognize that while parents are the most important protective factor for their children, raising kids today is more challenging than many of us bargained for. Compulsive screen use, harmful social media, cyberbullying, adult content, and predators are just a few of the things we are dealing with at an unprecedented level. So to go through some logistics for this series, you will only be able to see and hear me and our guest speakers. So you will all be muted, but the Q&A feature is open for your questions and comments. Just make sure to click the anonymous feature if that is important to you. And at the end of the presentation, we'll have time for questions, which I will pull from the Q&A. I do want to remind you that this presentation is intended for adults. So we are immensely grateful to our sponsors for this event. We couldn't do this without amazing community support. We want to specifically thank our champion sponsors, Billings Public Schools, St. Vincent Healthcare, Underwriter Automotive, and Simply Local Magazine. So today, I'm so excited to introduce you to our speakers, Dr. Mitch Prinstein and Dr. Eva Telser. So I'll tell you a little about them and then we'll turn the time over to them. So Dr. Prinstein is the Chief Science Officer of the American Psychological Association, is Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience at UNC Chapel Hill, and is co-director of the Winston National Center on Technology Use. He also served as the Director of Clinical Psychology at Yale University. His research has examined interpersonal models of internalizing symptoms and health risk behaviors among adolescents, with a specific focus on the unique role of on and offline peer relationships in the developmental psychopathology of depression and self-injury. He is a board-certified clinical psychologist and scientist who has been studying child and adolescent mental health for over 25 years, publishing over 200 scientific manuscripts and 12 books. He is regularly featured as an expert in psychological science in consultation to government agencies and nonprofits, as a witness testifying before the U.S. Senate, in 2 TEDx talks, and within hundreds of media appearances around the world. And I first heard Dr. Prinstein speak at a U.S. Senate hearing not too long ago and was so impressed with his perspective on the mental health issues that young people are facing today. And so I was so grateful that he graciously accepted my cold call and was willing to come and present for us today, along with his colleague, Dr. Eva Telser. So Dr. Telser is an associate professor of psychology and neuroscience at UNC Chapel Hill. She is an associate editor at Child Development and Social Cognitive Affective Neuroscience, and the co-director of the Winston National Center on Technology Use, Brain and Psychological Development. Her research examines how social and cultural processes shape adolescent brain development, with a focus on both pro-social and risk-taking behaviors, family and peer relationships, and social media and technology use. She has authored over 175 publications, has received numerous awards for her research contributions, and has been featured in the media numerous times. So today, Drs. Prinstein and Telser will deconstruct the psychological science on youth technology and social media use so we can understand what psychologists and what scientists have found, what it means for youth today, and what we can do about it. The results are sometimes frightening, but there is hope, especially if we take action now. So thank you for joining us, Dr. Prinstein and Dr. Telser. We are so happy to have you, and I will go ahead and turn it over to you for social media side effects, addressing rising rates of mental illness in our youth.
Great, thank you so much for having us. And can you all see the slides okay? All right, great. This is a talk that we've given around the country, and this is usually a talk we give in an hour. So we've tried to shorten it a bit, but part of the way we're going to shorten it is talk a little bit fast because there's so much information that we want to give you And so we're going to try to squeeze it all into this short talk today. And of course, give you an opportunity to ask us questions as we go. All right, so social media use has really changed the landscape of adolescent development. Adolescents today, particularly in terms of many of their peer relationships, look substantially different from adolescents and the way that they navigated peer relationships decades ago. So in a recent review paper that Dr. Prinstein and some of his colleagues wrote, they indicated many unique features of online peer experiences that really differentiate how social media has really transformed peer relationships. So for example, the way that individuals and teenagers in particularly are going to interact is much more public because it occurs on these online platforms. It's much more permanent because what they say and post is online and visible for a long and then sometimes permanent place. It's constantly available. There are quantifiable cues, for example, likes, comments, and followers that really have just substantially changed the way that these peer interactions are unfolding. In fact, if you look at the way that peer relationships looked decades ago in the 1960s, peer relationships looked something like this. In the 70s and 80s, they looked something like this. And now peer relationships are occurring online. And when they're not only online, but even when their peer interactions are happening in real life, they're often glued to their phones. So social media and technology has really transformed the way that peer relationships are unfolding today. In fact, social media is so omnipresent in adolescents' lives. 78% of 13 and 17-year-olds report that they are checking their devices hourly, and 46% are checking their phones almost constantly. This is a steep rise from just 2018, when only 24% of adolescents were reporting checking their phones constantly. So this is increasing a lot over the past several years and has become a really important way that adolescents' development and peer relationships is unfolding today. This is data that Dr. Prinstein and I collected just to give you a snapshot of how much time and how often they're checking their phones. I know this is a messy plot, but what I want you to see is the frequency with which they're picking up their phones. So this axis on the top bar is showing you the amount of times that teenagers are picking up their phones every single day. Each of those sort of columns there is one day of a week, and each dot is a participant or a teenager. And on average, adolescents are picking up their phone to check those devices 100 times a day, but this is in the upwards of 400 to 500 times a day for some teenagers. The bottom plot here is showing the average time they're spending on their smartphones. Again, each dot is a person, each column is a day. On average, teenagers are spending about 8 hours on their phones a day. And again, if you look at that y-axis, this ranges to over 16 hours a day for some adolescents. So not only are they constantly checking their phones, they are just glued to their screens around the clock. Now, this rise in social media use is happening at a very important developmental period when the adolescent brain is going through substantial transformation and is becoming especially sensitive to its environment. The environment has a large role in shaping the way that the brain is going to develop during this developmental period. And the social media context can definitely shape and impact the way that the brain is developing during this window of growth and reorganization in the brain. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about the science behind how social media is impacting adolescent health. We'll also tell you a little bit about how social media use might be influencing the way that the brain is developing today. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Prinstein, who's going to tell you a little bit about what we know about the role of social media in adolescent development.
Sure, thank you so much. What we've tried to do is to unpack all of the questions that scientists ask when we think about the role of social media on development, because it's really much more than just how much kids are spending their time on social media. It's about the specific content and the specific features that kids are engaging with. But this might not be the story that you have heard so far. And one of the reasons why is because science takes a lot longer to do than some of the dialogue has been going on so far. You may have heard some things already about the concept that social media is linked to a variety of different kinds of mental health measures. But it's important to recognize that when those things are measured at the exact same period of time, so we can say someone who is experiencing depression, for instance, is also simultaneously someone that's reporting that they spend many hours on social media, you have a bit of a chicken and egg problem. So you can't really determine whether it might be the case that one of those factors, like social media, caused depression, whether depression might be why they spent time on social media, or whether it's merely a correlation that doesn't imply a causal relationship between those two things at all. So what we want to talk with you about is some of the emerging science that's coming out, keeping in mind that science goes pretty slowly, but tech goes very quickly. So if you want to understand how tech is affecting kids' development over 5 years, it of course is going to take over 5 years to do that research study. But in that time, the platforms that kids are on it's changing so rapidly that we're even having a hard time keeping up with it as scientists. So with that, we're going to go ahead and talk about the different ways in which we might see relationships between tech or social media use and adolescent adjustment. Keep in mind, of course, that there are probably numerous different ways of interpreting some of these associations. For instance, we do know that kids who are experiencing psychological mental health difficulties probably are using their social media platforms in different ways than others. We're also knowing that tech can provide kids with opportunities for soothing or coping with stress, or helping them to develop particular skills that are harder to engage in real life, IRL. We also know, on the other hand, though, that the relationship between tech and mental health might have to do with the fact that tech is taking kids away from things that otherwise would have been adaptive and helpful for them to engage in offline. So as you can see, it's a very complex relationship, and we're going to try and pick out a few of the findings that seem to be suggesting more of that longitudinal association and really more of the likely way in which tech is related. And here's the bottom line. It's not just about whether kids use tech or not. It's a combination between who kids even were before they logged in at all, their strengths and weaknesses, and maybe areas of vulnerability or resilience. And then what specific online behavior are they interacting with? So if you have a child who's particularly resilient and they're using social media to establish adaptive social relationships where they're talking about factual information that they're reading online, that might be perfectly fine. Whereas a child who might experience some social or psychological vulnerabilities and they're being exposed to the worst possible content that's particularly addictive or harmful or hateful online might have a particularly worse outcome. So again, we're really focused here on what are those particular, under what conditions and for which children might be there specific features or contents of social media that might be helpful or that might be harmful to youth development. So we're going to talk about those very quickly here. There are a number of positive attributes, and some of these are getting lost in the way it's being talked about in the media. In particular, people who are members of groups that are underrepresented within their communities. That might be due to racial or ethnic or sexual or gender identity groups, are experiencing positive benefits to social media by learning about relevant health information, coping with some of the experiences of prejudice or discrimination that they're experiencing in their offline contexts, or being able to talk with others and receive support. So we do know that there are ways that social media can provide a very important beneficial effects for kids. We also know that the friendships that kids have online can be friendships that are with kids that they know they'll never meet in person, but nevertheless, they share emotionally intimate and vulnerable information with them and establish a real friendship. And that friendship does seem to buffer the effects of stress on dire psychological outcomes, including the likelihood of attempting suicide. We know that kids' reports of social media during COVID actually was beneficial to them in getting more companionship and lowering their mental health distress. And we're also seeing that kids are engaging in more civic activism online than they had experienced offline before it was possible to engage in kind of a worldwide communication on issues that matter to them. We know that There are some ways of using social media that are better than others. One of the ways that we know can be harmful potentially is when kids are not going online just to establish relationships, but to compare themselves to others or to specifically try and get more likes and more followers and positive feedback for their selfies or things like that. That seems to be directly associated with increased risk in depression, anxiety, and also weight related behaviors. That might be especially the case for adolescent females because females are already being socialized to think far more than is fair on social relationships as a value of their worth, or in seeing others post images that are really focusing on things like body shape. But do keep in mind that that doesn't mean that boys are immune to this as well. In fact, there's a growing concern among some males who are sharing body shapes as well as a way of engaging in social comparison, and some males are also at risk. There's some really interesting research that's demonstrating that when we see a post with a lot of likes on it, it actually changes what we think others believe and feel, because we're, as humans, pretty bad at estimating the behaviors and the feelings of others. So if we see someone post, for instance, something with a risk behavior, like maybe their interest in drinking 5 or more drinks on a single occasion, which we would call heavy episodic drinking in the scientific literature, and we see that a bunch of people have liked that post, we have a choice. We could say, well, it looks like 10 people liked it, and those 10 people must be heavy drinkers. Or we could say, wow, that must represent kind of a huge proportion of everyone out there who feels the same way. Well, if that's an error that adults are likely to make, it's important to recognize that teens are especially likely to make that kind of error. And this is a research study that demonstrated exactly that. Teens in 9th grade who saw alcohol-related posts with likes then developed a sense that their peers were all quite permissive of drinking 5 or more drinks on a single occasion, which is a fair amount for an adult, but certainly a lot for a 13-year-old. And once kids believed that their peers approved of that behavior, that was subsequently predictive of at what age kids initially had their own first drinking experiences of 5 or more drinks on a single occasion. It's also important to recognize how much we have a new form of stress that kids are telling us they're experiencing because of social media. This comes from a variety of different sources. The concern they have that if they're not constantly on social media, they might miss out on important social information. The sense that they have to be available constantly to all of their friends to respond to their posts as soon as their friends post them. And the concern that they might post something and it might get dragged or criticized on social media, ruining their reputation, as well as a feeling of cognitive overload simply with the amount of information that they're consuming all at once. And all of these factors turn out to be quite important. In our research, we found that almost 50% of kids are reporting significant levels of stress coming from these combined sources, what's now referred to as digital stress. And the more the kids experience stress, the more likely they were to experience depression a year later. I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Telzer.
Great. So one of the other aspects of digital media and social media is that it significantly interferes with sleep. So adolescence is a time when individuals are already substantially sleep deprived. So on the left is a figure demonstrating the percent of students across 9th to 12th grade who are getting the recommended amount of sleep needed for healthy development. This is 8 hours a night. And as you can see here, only about 42 or so percent of 9th graders are getting the recommended amount of sleep. This steeply declines by 12th grade, where only about 25% of 12th graders are getting the recommended amount of sleep. Sleep is absolutely essential for development, including healthy brain development, academic achievement, peer relationships, mood. And we know that technology use and social media is interfering with this already important concern about adolescents not getting enough sleep. In fact, there's research showing that 60% of adolescents report viewing or interacting with their screens the hour before bedtime, and interacting online, being exposed to the blue light emitted from smartphones. This delays the release of melatonin and delays the onset of sleep for adolescents. 90% of studies, for example, show that more screen time is associated with poorer sleep health. And so this is a big concern of ours, that the mere use of interacting online, as well as being exposed to the light emitted through phones, is associated with declines in sleep health during a really critical developmental period when sleep is so important, yet not often received by the majority of adolescents in this age group. We also know that social connection is absolutely important for adolescents. In fact, they have this biological need to be connected to their peers. Many adolescents report that they use social media for the very reason of being connected to their peers. They go online, they interact on social media platforms, they text their peers for that need to connect with others. However, what we've found is that in the immediate hour after teens use social media, while they might feel more connected in that moment, by the end of the day, they actually feel less socially connected to the extent that they were online interacting with their peers more. So while this might have this short-term boost to help them feel more connected, that is a fleeting sense of social connection, because by the end of the day, they actually feel more lonely if they used social media for longer that day. Now, finally, we've been conducting research linking social media use to adolescent brain development. As I mentioned at the very beginning, this developmental period is not only a time when social media use is increasing substantially, but the brain is undergoing real substantial changes in the way that it's structured and organized. Around the time of puberty, the brain starts to change and adapt and sort of get ready for adulthood. Now, what we found in one of the first longitudinal studies that tracked adolescent social media use and their changing brain is that adolescents who report checking their social media platforms more frequently. So if you recall from one of those early graphs, I showed you that adolescents are checking their phones almost constantly. Some of them are doing this 100 times a day, some upwards of 400 times a day. Adolescents who are more habitually checking their social media platforms are showing changes in how their brain is developing over the next 3 years, in which they show this hypersensitivity in brain regions that respond to rewards and social cues in the environment. So this may set the stage for lifelong adjustment in terms of how they respond to peers and regulate their behavior, and may be associated with other downstream consequences like social anxiety or potentially social media addiction later in development. So given all that we know, what are some key things that parents, teachers, and others can do to help teenagers thrive in the context of their digital worlds? And I'll turn it back over to Dr. Prinstein.
I will say that as a parent of a 10 and 12-year-olds who are quite interested in using technology, that the information that I'm about to present to you is much easier said than done. I just want to acknowledge how difficult this is and how much parents are in a really tough situation. We hope that having some of the scientific knowledge about what's coming out so far, plus your knowledge as the expert on your child together, will give you the information you need to decide what is best for your particular family situation. The information that we're going to provide hopefully is generally helpful, but like all parenting advice, please take it or leave it as it applies to you. The first, of course, is that it does seem like it is a good idea to try and wait before allowing your child to have unfettered access to technology. There are a variety of parental controls, some of them, unfortunately, a little bit harder to access and manage than we might like, but there are a variety of parental controls that allows you to really protect which kinds of content, platforms, for how much time within each specific application or whichever device you have. That can be really, really useful. Most parents tell us that they are most likely to let their child have access to a device because they fear that their child will be the only one not online, not participating in the social interactions, and will suffer accordingly. We do not have any data to support that at this point. In fact, some emerging data to suggest that there might be the kids who are not using social media and not using devices might actually be the more popular and the more socially well-adjusted compared to the others. So it is possible to survive in 2023 without having a smartphone and unfettered access to these devices. We don't know very much about the group called Wait Until 8th, but it's a great example of a group that's tried to create a more of a community-based pact for families to stay together. How about if we all wait until we give our kids these devices, at least until the 8th grade? Of course, what we do encourage that's a good idea for social media use is moderation. And keep in mind, as parents, it's our job to make sure that when our kids might feel even biologically kind of enticed or tempted to engage in a behavior that might have some potential harm associated with it, especially if they engage in it in irresponsible or reckless ways, that we need to sometimes be the bad guy and go ahead and create limits or encourage more safe use. And social media now seems to be one of those behaviors. It's not a bad thing to do at all, but if you're engaged in it, you want to engage in it in a way that recognizes some of the limitations and some of the potential concerns out there. So how do you really help kids to understand that there are going to be both positive and negative effects of using social media, and for them to understand and monitor for themselves, when am I using it to get the best version, the best balance that I possibly can? Because most kids will tell us that they themselves recognize that, oh my goodness, I've been on this platform for 2.5 hours, which is about 2.5 hours or 2 and 25 minutes longer than I was planning on spending on this. And I'm not feeling good anymore, but I feel stuck on it. So I think helping kids to recognize that they need to be good monitors of their own behavior. One way of doing that is engaging in a practice that's starting to get a little bit of empirical support, which is called mindful social media use. It sounds a lot more complicated than it is. It's just getting into the habit of, as you pick up your device, thinking to yourself, how long am I planning to get on social media right now? And what's my purpose? If you think, I have 5 minutes right now and I'm a little bit bored and I want to be entertained or see what's trending or get rid of my notifications, and you think about that as you log in or as you kind of press on that app, there's a higher likelihood that you'll recognize when you've met that goal and said, yes, I've cleared off all the notifications. It's been about 5-10 minutes. And now I recognize that I'm getting sucked into the AI or the machine learning algorithms that are trying to keep me here longer than I initially intended. So setting a goal with an expected time and purpose, and then every once in a while evaluating, gee, it's been a little bit longer than I expected. Have I met all my goals? Yes, then get off. That's a helpful practice to teach kids. Most parents do a fantastic job of talking with their kids about their social lives. But remarkably, only about a third of parents talk about their kids' social lives online. And that makes perfect sense. Most of us did not grow up with this. So it's really challenging to know even what to ask kids or how to engage with them. But it is really important to help kids to feel empowered by asking them to teach you about what they're doing online, what they're seeing online, and how they interpret what they see online. That way, it's an opportunity to really understand that kids are seeing things, but they're still young and they still don't remember to think critically about whether what they're seeing is real and authentic, whether it represents majority opinions or not, and how to process something they might see that might be a little bit disturbing. But by having them teach you what these platforms are for, how they use it, what they're seeing, why they think kids are commenting the way that they're commenting, it's a way in to help kids. We will say that simply having your kids' passwords or being aware of their accounts and following them is not sufficient. The vast majority of young people tell us that they have platforms, passwords, profiles that their parents don't know anything about. So it is really important to actively monitor kids' engagement in social media, not just by passively watching what they're doing, but by talking with them frequently about what they do. Based on the results about the effects on sleep and the idea that this is actually affecting the size of kids' brains, it seems like it would be a good idea if we, as an entire community of parents and as a nation, just started to reinforce a no-tech when you should be asleep, which for most school districts and when wake time needs to be, what probably means no tech after 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock. Remarkably, a lot of kids report that they're kind of a little bit satisfied and relieved when they can blame their parents that they have to get offline by 9 o'clock. It makes them not have to worry about what's happening. They know that anything that they miss, they can just blame it on their parents. And but it also lets them just stop and decompress and get some sleep. And that's really helpful. We also have to teach schools to stop making deadlines that are at midnight, because that encourages kids to be on their devices for schoolwork, but simultaneously they use it for social media all the way until midnight. We together as a community of parents can make this happen simply by all deciding at once that this is what we believe is best for kids. We don't need any law for this. We can just all do it together as best practices. We also are at the point where we need to encourage kids that when they are offline, they need to use it as an opportunity for what we call face-to-face or voice-to-voice interaction. And that's because a lot of kids now, as you saw from the pictures early on, are using their offline time as an opportunity to take pictures or to simultaneously post to their individual profiles and then all stare at their phones together in a kind of parallel play where they're reporting who reported on which of their posts and who's doing better with who's following the different kinds of things they said about their offline interaction, rather than actually putting down their phones, looking each other in the face, and just having an interaction that has no online counterpart. So a lot of kids are starting to informally report that they're experiencing social anxiety when they're in offline situations, because they actually have lost the ability to engage in, spontaneous speech with others. They're so used to really thoughtfully thinking out, thoughtfully planning their texts and their posts and their pictures that, sometimes they might be using their phones in offline contexts because they're feeling a little bit anxious and out of practice with how to have interactions where they look at each other in the eye. So we need to help kids practice that again. We have been asked to consult and co-develop a curriculum that's available for middle school students so they can start learning about the science of the brain and the science of psychology and understand what's starting to be learned with social media findings. That's still in a preliminary form, but it's free and it's perfectly available for parents to also download and use as ways to help engage in dialogue with their kids. It's all available at teensandtech.org. We're very grateful that a lot of our work is possible thanks to the generous contributions of donors. And our donors have also have been able to help us create that website and create a variety of resources available for parents on there. We're always open to feedback and information about what we can do to make that even more possible. One of the things that our donor was able to do was to pay for open access for a brand new handbook that summarizes the the psychological science on digital media use and mental health. So this book is totally for free now. So we're happy to say with no conflict of interest whatsoever that you're more than welcome to just download a copy if you'd like and have this available for free. Pass it along to the teachers or administrators at your school if you would like. All you have to do is go to teensandtech.org and click on handbook, and it will direct you right to the link where you can download the entire book for free. Thanks so much to the generosity of one of our donors. And with that, we'll stop for questions. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much. That was so informative. I just really appreciate everything that you shared. I feel more empowered as a parent to be able to address these things with my own kids. We do have several questions that have come in. So let's start with this one. What is a healthy and responsible amount of screen time for children?
Yeah, our research is, and the research in the field is showing it's not really so much about the number of hours. It's really about what they're doing. So if they're being creative and they're reading the news and they're talking about it with their friends online, that might be fine to do for many hours. But if they're being exposed to content that's teaching them how to engage in anorexia-like behaviors or how to cut their skin, to deal with stress and to conceal those behaviors from their parents, which is one of the other things that we are seeing in the literature is happening a lot on social media, then that's something that obviously we would say no, no time at all. That's not appropriate. What we recommend is that you talk with your kids and ask them whether they feel like they're spending so much time that they can't stop even when they want to, or that they're having a hard time fulfilling their daily roles and routines because they feel like they must be online all the time. That's a good warning sign that they're spending too much time and you need to start weaning them off.
Okay, thank you. So maybe along the same lines, maybe you kind of already answered this, but maybe you can add something to it. Is there a concern regarding use for educational purposes? So if they're spending a lot of time on it on Khan Academy or YouTube Kids or things like that?
If the science demonstrates that the use of technology for educational purposes can actually be really beneficial and helpful. The problem, of course, is whether kids are spending their entire time focused on those educational apps or activities, or whether they're being distracted from their work by checking social media, on the same device every few moments. So it's really about how you've set up those screen controls. Dr. Telzer, did you want to address that too?
I was going to say largely the same thing, that the educational apps are largely positive. I think some of them are not. There's multitasking involved in some types of online platforms for educational purposes that can be better optimized, especially for children, for example, with ADHD. But we don't have the same concerns whatsoever about these educational platforms.
Okay, thank you. So here's another one. How do you think I can connect with my teenager who is on her screen all the time? Do you have a starter question? This attendee said, you provided a lot of ideas, but sometimes I feel overwhelmed and I don't even know where to begin.
Yeah, I might start by saying, tell me what's the funniest thing that you've seen on social media today. Tell me about it, and really helping to engage kids in a way that feels not judgmental. And then when that feels safe and kids are feeling, happy to share with you, say, tell me about something that might have been a little bit confusing or something you were surprised that someone posted, and again, really helping them to recognize that they can talk with you about this, and they can, you're not going to judge them, but really recognize, look, this social media is playing a role in my child's life. I want to be invited in. I want to learn. I want to understand. I want them to feel safe to talk with me about it. I want to help teach them how to consume the information, but empower them. They are the experts. And, what does it mean when someone likes this or when someone retweets this? And what do you think it means? And really help them to feel like they're in control.
Excellent. Here's a question about gaming and the types of gaming. So do you have any thoughts about violent gaming and the impact that has on children?
There's been a fair amount of research looking at gaming and its effect, and the results are mixed. And maybe Dr. Prinstein can jump in if there's some evidence that I'm missing, but it appears to be that the associations are bidirectional. And so adolescents who come in to a gaming environment, for example, with certain characteristics or personalities, are going to be more likely to be influenced potentially by the violent gaming than other teens. And so it's not that any adolescent coming in and using gaming, and particularly violent gaming, is therefore going to become violent. It's really the characteristics of the adolescent coming into that situation themselves that are going to influence whether or not that gaming environment is going to be good or bad or sort of neutral.
Okay, thank you. So there's a lot of talk lately about legislating technology, legislating screen time and social media. Can you give your thoughts on that? What do you think would be appropriate legislation that could support parents as they try to navigate these things with their kids?
Well, it's a complicated question, and some of it gets into legal issues that are probably beyond our expertise. But from a scientific perspective, we certainly know that exposure to some of the content that's discriminatory or hateful, or that teaches kids to engage in dangerous behaviors like cutting or anorexia, those are things that, much like on other kinds of media content, those can be restricted, but right now they're not restricted within social media. So there might be some ways in which simply ensuring that kids are not exposed to inappropriate content could be something that was done at the legislative level. We also want to think about kids' privacy and the extent to which their data are being used to advertise to them or to inform algorithms that are really influencing how much time they spend. And if we think about the idea that kids' brains are developing and they're not yet as developed as adults, that suggests there might be some vulnerabilities that kids experience where we have to provide them with opportunities to consent or to understand what the risks are in ways that are different from the ways that adults currently do it. We all get that screen that's like 70 screens long and it says, do you consent? But, that's not written in the form of a child's, nor does it say, if you get this, you're consenting for your child to have their data exposed. And that also is an issue that might be ripe for legislation.
Thank you. So this one comes from a parent who says, I've dropped the ball and my kid is already immersed in the social media world. How can I backpedal and wean her off social media in a way that will preserve our relationship?
It's really about giving adolescents the autonomy to help them make decisions and understand what they're doing, and not to come into it judging what they're doing, but to help them understand the behaviors that they're engaging in and having this like back and forth discussion. So it might have to start off like Dr. Prinstein said, which is like, what's the funniest thing you saw on social media today? Or like, can you explain to me like, what are all these likes or stories or things that as a parent you might not understand, and start to use it as an opportunity to understand what your teen is doing online, and then be able to have those conversations about how it might be impacting them and maybe how to sort of back off of it a little bit. Perhaps you can start with some nighttime restrictions, because we know that it's going to impact their sleep and that's going to impact their brain development. And that is a little bit more straightforward than some of these more abstract concepts that it may be impacting.
Thank you. So this one is you kind of mentioned the likes and helping them, talk about those and understand those and explain them to you as a parent. This question says, I especially like the portion where you talked about likes on posts. My child is obsessed with getting likes. It's so concerning to me. I appreciate you bringing light and science to back up my concerns. So what are some talking points that you could specifically get at and address that side of things with the kids?
Yeah, so we hear from a lot of kids that they feel a remarkable amount of pressure to like their friends' posts. In fact, they'll get in trouble with their friends if they don't like their posts right away. So what happens is that there's a lot of kids who tell us they simply scroll and like every single thing in their feed as a way of trying to increase their follower count and also as a way of trying to be a good friend. But what happens then is that means that sometimes there are likes attached to things that are surprising or that are counter to what you or your child or what even your child's friend might have valued or believed in the first place. So it's good to talk with kids about, why do you think there are so many likes on this post? Why do you think there are no likes on this post? Do you think everyone likes it because they believe in that post? Are there ever times when you like a post when you don't believe in it, or you're just trying to seem cool by saying you believe in it, but you don't? And as you can imagine, that starts to become a very rich conversation to help kids to unpack, what does it mean when you see that, and what's real and what's not? And if even your own behavior sometimes reflects what you truly believe and what you're just trying to be nice by liking something, that means that you should interpret that whenever you see other likes. Not to mention the whole notion of bots and the possibility that some of these likes might not even be from human beings at all. So, and I just think that there's a lot of social media literacy we have to teach our kids to help them understand it, because at first blush, we're all likely to say, wow, there's 20 likes, so that means a lot of people agree with that. And really helping kids to digest that in the way that makes sense, and maybe even check in with them and say, wow, that, are you surprised by that? Do you think that many of the people that we know in our community or in our social circle would feel that way? And just really use it as a teaching opportunity to help kids have dialogues about it.
That's fantastic. So this question says, you mentioned briefly ADHD. Does an ADHD child have a harder time disconnecting? Are they impacted differently by social media, such as friend alerts and likes, than a child without ADHD?
I think there's a lot of emerging research on both using technology to help kids with ADHD, but also the opposite, which is what you're referring to, is how these alerts and other aspects of digital media and social media in particular might be particularly hard for youth with ADHD, and particularly to disengage. And that's absolutely the case. And so there's likely tools, and I don't have them in my pocket to give you at this moment, but there's likely tools that we need for different adolescents. And so for adolescents with ADHD, we might need to have different conversations or put different types of restrictions on teens' phones that may stop those alerts, for example, that may distract them. For example, if they're working on homework and they're getting alerts on their phone, it'll be especially likely to draw their attention and make it even harder to disengage from the digital media.
Thank you. So here's a question about COVID's impact. So how did COVID impact the data regarding screen time and social media?
Well, there's not a lot of data on this specifically, but it seems that a lot of people kind of opened the floodgates during COVID by letting their kids spend more time than they might have had we not been in that situation. And now there's a little bit of backpedaling potentially to do. There are some data as well indicating that the use of screens during COVID helps create a sense of companionship when kids were otherwise feeling isolated. But again, it might have been a temporary fix, but it's important to help kids to have the kinds of social interaction that are not mediated by a device now as well.
Absolutely. I love how you talked about how sometimes it is the cool kids that don't have social media that they're able to develop social skills and things that maybe the others might struggle with. But this question addresses that, or asks a little bit more about that. Talks about, how to help kids who feel like they're being left out of activities because they don't have a phone. Do you have anything to say to that?
This is the social comparison process that we were talking about before, and it's very, very easy to fall into that trap. But again, an important way to teach kids about social media literacy and say, yes, it does look like that on this particular night, these particular kids were together at that event. It's true, we see that posting, but it makes it appear as if that means that child is always surrounded by friends. They are always going out and doing things, and reminding them, it's likely that this child also has times when they're home alone. They might even feel lonely sometimes. They're not going to post that though. So really to normalize, what you're seeing is the highlight reel of this person's life. It's not necessarily an accurate daily diary of what their real experiences or emotions are. And to your point about the cool kids, one of the things that we've heard, again, just anecdotally, we've talked to so many groups, is the extent to which kids recognize that what's on there is so fake. And a lot of these very socially competent kids really crave that real emotional connection with people, something that feels, authentic. And this is what gave rise to the whole Finsta phenomenon, which people might be aware of, kids creating a second Instagram profile with a fake name. So they call it fake Instagram or Finsta, in order to post their actual genuine feelings and share it with their friends. So they have their real Instagram, which is kind of their public image, with all the best things about them. But then they're so striving for real social connection that they've created fake profiles that they only share with those they already know and trust, to share their real uncensored feelings. It's in some ways a statement of where teens are, that they feel so disconnected and lonely with the way that social media is initially built. but it also is an optimistic hope of how we can help kids to recognize that natural urge to create a real sense of connection, which could be a way to either steer them towards less social media use or back into the real world to have more authentic interactions with them. So there's a moment of hope that can come from that, that can be used as a leverage point, for having conversations with kids about why they might not want to spend as much time as they are on their devices.
Excellent. Do you feel a change coming? Do you feel like young people are starting to kind of wake up and that they're going to make a difference in this because they see the harms that it's causing in their own lives?
Yeah, just anecdotally, there's a new movement now to use like old school cameras instead of an iPhone camera among teenagers. Like, this is cool. This is seen as cool now to use a real camera. And so I think that there's this movement being led by teenagers to sort of backpedal away from all of the modern technology and get out of what they have been so immersed in for so long.
That's fantastic. I love that. We have several other questions that I don't think we're going to have time for. We so appreciate all the answers that you've given us. And I will say that all of this information, the recording for this will be available on our website, and we will email you and let you know when that's available. And also I might ask Dr. Telzer and Dr. Prinstein if we can just send you a few of these questions via email and maybe get your answers that we can also post on the website with the recording if there were some that didn't get answered. Okay, appreciate that so much. So thank you so much for your time. I have learned so much. I know we have had a lot of positive responses from our attendees on the Q&A, so we appreciate everyone for being here and for learning with us today. Do you have a closing 30-second message that you would like to end with before I close this out?
Just say that, we're talking about the role of parents, but I think I'm also thinking about the role for kids themselves and helping them to understand how to make wise decisions can also be really powerful. I've really appreciated efforts where kids have been asked to consider why billions of dollars have gone into creating devices and platforms just to let them hang out with their friends. What might be the reason why those are being done for free? And that really helps kids to think about their behavior and what they're involved in, in a little bit of a different way. And also helping them to recognize, some of the, why is it that people who study this topic or who have developed the platforms themselves are wary of letting their kids be involved in it, so much. And just giving kids some of those questions for thought can sometimes lead them to make their own decisions and feel empowered to do this in a way that doesn't have to always come from kind of parental, limit setting or discipline. And I think that's also just another powerful thing to engage kids in that dialogue.
Thank you. Dr. Telzer, anything from you?
Yeah, I think Dr. Prinstein says it really nice, is to really give teens the drive and initiative that they have at this developmental period and engage in those conversations so that parents and teens can be on the same page together so that they don't feel that they're being restricted or told what to do. I think that there is pushback from teens when that kind of message is delivered. So to the best that one can, and like Dr. Prinstein said earlier, easier said than done, we engage with teenagers and have these conversations with them and learn from them as we help them to adapt and use social media and technology in the most positive way that they can.
Well said. Thank you so much. One of my favorite things that you said today was that as parents, we are the experts on our children and that we need to decide what is best for our families. And we believe at Project Stand, one of our guiding principles is that parents are the most important protective factor for our kids. And so as we engage in this, as we become educated, as we get resources, as we communicate with our children and really develop that healthy relationship with them, we will be able to help them navigate things and be a protective factor for them. So for next week, I just want to remind you all that we will be talking with our boots on the ground panel, which will consist of a child crimes detective, an ER doctor, a therapist, and a middle school principal. And they will all talk about what they wish parents knew about technology. So we're very excited to hear from them next week. So invite a friend, go to mediasafety.org to sign up. And just a reminder again, that if you can't watch it live, we will notify you when the recordings are available. So thank you again, Dr. Telzer and Dr. Prinstein, and we will see all of you next week.
Bye, thank you.